Okay, here we are. Round 4 of Book Sandwiched in 2023. It occurred to me the other day that I've been welcoming everyone and thanking and introducing people, and I don't think I introduced myself. I'm not that famous, so not all of you know me. My name's Louise Richardson. I chair the selection committee for Book Sandwiched In. As always, I want to thank other members of the committee, Margot Brown, who is joining us via Zoom, Lisa Derrickson, Dusty Hewitt, Gary McCaslin, and Pam Sonnefeld. We're always happy to have new book lovers join us on the committee. It only takes a few minutes, a few meetings. We did it this year in 2. And it's a lot of fun. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I also want to thank Card Carrying Books and Gifts for their support. They printed our bookmarks for us this year, and they kindly offered a complimentary copy of each book of the book to each presenter. So now usually I go into about the book, but I have something else to sell you today. February is Library Advocacy Month. That means that we're telling our legislators how important it is to fund public libraries, the fact that they are centers of our community, try to educate them about the myriad things that libraries do. I'm on the local library board, and I'm not sure I understand everything we do. There are so many things. Pauline and her staff put up a big question on the wall. What would you like to see at your library? We're starting to think about what's coming in the future once we finish the renovations to the children's room. And she organized everything into different categories, but one of those categories was things that we're already doing, but people obviously don't understand that. So we have a lot of work to do. So I have a couple of things. I have some postcards here. Very easy. You don't even have to write a message. You just have to put your name and your county down. We would like you to not take these away, but sign one and leave it here. And we will be taking these to Albany on February 23rd when we go to meet with our representatives, and we hope to have a huge stack of them. So I will put these over on the counter and find a pen. If you prefer to be that person who does things online, there's a QR code here that I'll also put over there. You can also do both. You can sign a hard copy and do it online. And then for anyone who's willing, I would love at the end of this to get some pictures of people with I love library signs so that we can just kind of flood social media with this and remind people how important libraries are. So that's that. Today's book is Horse by Geraldine Brooks. If you haven't read it, there are 8 copies in the library system, and no, that's not right. I forgot to update that. I think there are 21 copies. This is a very popular book.
I know, right?
And it's also available as an audiobook or an ebook for download. So there's no excuse. Judy Rowe is with us today to talk about Horse. Those of you who have been faithfully coming to Book Sandwiched In over the last few years will remember that she was last with us in 2020 when she presented about Michelle Obama's Becoming. So we're really happy to have her back. Judy's lived in the Corning Horseheads area for more than 30 years. She was born in Riverside, California, and traveled widely, first as a part of a military family and then as a part of her career. He has undergraduate degrees in civil and industrial engineering and a master's degree in industrial and labor relations from Cornell University. She retired from Corning Incorporated after 27 years, and for the past 7 years has been focused on building her own consulting practice. She and her husband, Joe, have been married that right?
38 years.
38 years and have 2 sons. Her passions are justice, equity, and belonging, and she loves helping others discover and develop their strengths through coaching and training. Thanks for coming today, Judy.
Thank you. Hello again. Nice to be here today. And thank you so much, Louise, for the invitation to come back. And certainly to all of you to come here today to talk about horse. And I'll get started in just a second, but I also want to recognize Card Carrying for giving me a copy of this book. And if you notice, it looks like it hasn't even been read because it really hasn't. I listened to the book. I'm an auditory learner, but I always like having copies of books too to refer to, which I'll do today. So to get to start, I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm not a horse lover. I'm not saying that I don't like animals, so don't take it to me mad. And I don't love horses. They're beautiful. I just have never ridden them, and I don't bet on them, and I just don't. And so I was like, horse, okay. So I was like figuring out how can I connect with this book? So I read the book through, and it was quite rich. So I want to hear from all of you. I don't want to be just me talking to you. I want you to talk to me. And those online, feel free to raise your hand. I can't see you, but if you just unmute and say, hey, I have a comment, I'll certainly stop and pause. But I do want you to talk to me about, so how many have read it? Don't be ashamed. I no shame your game, but just enough of you, okay? And for those of you who have started it, that's fine. Great, yay. So I at least have a few people that have read it, but we'll talk about things that you can relate to, whether you read the book or not. So again, I was like this morning, even I woke up at 4 a.m. going, okay, it's book sandwich today. And I was kind of like, my husband's sleeping. So I got my phone out and I was starting to take notes. And when my husband and I drove over to, believe it or not, we're starting to work out. But we drove to the place to work out. And I said, Joe, I'm really kind of struggling here because although I like the book, I'm not saying I didn't, it's just tough. It's a tough, multi-layered book for me. So he says, well, I said, it's about horse racing and horse and, enslaved people in the history and racism. I said, it's very rich. So he goes, your family had history. And I'm like, really? This is my husband. He's not supposed to know that. I'm supposed to know that, right? So then he goes, yeah, your family had some involvement with horse racing. My family is from Aberdeen, Maryland. I don't know if you know where that is, Aberdeen Proving Ground was in the news many, many years ago, with the scandal there. But my dad being in the Air Force, he worked there as a civilian. But anyway, I called my mom and I'm like, hey, Joe said, and I talked to my brother, hey, and they said, yeah, of course. So this is the connection with horse racing for my family, being that they were, my mother's generation was during civil rights. By the way, this is the first day of Black history, chosen specifically. I wanted to be here to talk about this book on the first day of Black History Month. And my mom reminded me that my dad used to sell newspapers at the racetrack. Oh, I know, right? To make extra money. She used to clean the houses of the people where they stayed to come in to do that. And then she also said that my dad's family would take the blankets that are put on the horse before you put the saddle on. They would take them and clean them with hot steaming water and lye before the races. I know, right? So I was like, really? So she goes, yes. And just knowing that history, that people would come from Florida up through Aberdeen to get to New York seasonally, and they would stop there for the races at the Havity Grace horse racetrack. So I thought, wow, that's an interesting thing that I didn't know about my own history, but it's certainly something I can relate to because my family worked extremely hard, especially during Jim Crow era, certainly civil rights era, and then even now. And so since I've seen you last, my dad did pass like the year after I did Michelle Obama's becoming, but I will always remember that as a fond testament or testimony about him and his opportunity to give me that book to be inspired by. So we're here to talk about horse, right? So given that I have that connection, what is horse about? Does somebody want to summarize for me? Like, even if you don't want to summarize, I could read first and then we can summarize. Would that be easier? Like vocal cords? Okay, here's what I'll do. I'll read the jacket because I think it's a wonderful kind of way of figuring out how this book all comes together. So Kentucky, 1850, an enslaved groom and Bay Foal forge a bond of understanding that will carry the horse to record-setting victories across the South. When the nation erupts in civil war, an internet artist who made his name on paintings of the racehorse takes arms up for the Union. On a perilous night, he reunites with the stallion and his groom, very far from the glamour of any racetrack. So that's the first part, if you recall. The second part of the story is New York City, 1954. A gallery owner, celebrated for taking risks on edgy contemporary painters, becomes obsessed with 19th century equestrian oil paintings of a mysterious provenance. So that's the second part. The third part of the story is, and they all intertwine, Washington, D.C., a Smithsonian artist from Australia and a Nigerian American art historian find themselves unexpectedly connected through their shared interest of the horse, one studying the stallion's bones for clues in his speed and endurance, the other uncovering the lost history of unsung Black horsemen who were critical to the racing success. Inspired by the remarkable true story of the record-breaking thoroughbred Lexington, Horse is a novel of art and science, love and obsession, and our unfinished reckoning with racism. Indeed, right? So what was the connection between all three stories? There's no like A+ or anything like that. Does anybody want to take a stab?
It was the same horse?
It was the same horse. Yes, they all had that connection of the horse themselves. What got it started? Do you know? Do you remember? A painting, right? Yeah, the painting was connected. It went back into from the 1950s, right? 1850s, all the way to present day. Do you remember anything about the painting by any chance? Yeah, it was Jarrett, who's one of the main characters. And it was him and the thoroughbred Lexington, which name used to be called Darley, indeed, Darley. So did you like the book? That's easy enough to answer, right? Did you like the book? No. Tell me more. Yes and no. I want to hear yes and I want to see or no.
I didn't think it was up to all the hype, and I didn't love it the way I loved the author's other books,
Okay.
but I found so much to think about in it. And when you mention all those three things, everything was about racism, everything. And the author's description, even just a casual remark that somebody made, went so deep.
Yeah.
That for me, it was incredibly powerful. So while I didn't love it, I loved it in another way.
Yeah.
From what it taught us.
Sure. So not necessarily the literary presentation, but the depth of the messaging throughout the book. Okay, great. Thank you so much. You were finally saying no, didn't like it. What do you think? Yeah, Jim.
Because I hated reading about slavery, and looking at my age, I'm looking for more happiness in my life.
Amen to that, right? Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes.
They said it was about racism, but in that period, would that be Jim Crow racism? Or were they being objective or were they telling the story?
I don't know. What do you all think? Anyone? You didn't read the book. That's okay, but that's okay. That's a good question. Thank you. Anybody else want to take a stab? There's no wrong answers here. I'm not judging by any stretch. I learn something new every single day. Trust and believe. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
It starts with slavery, so ground zero for racism in this country. And then the piece in the 50s, sort of things getting better, but pre-civil rights movement.
Correct.
And then ends sadly with something that happened.
Yeah, what happened?
So don't want to spoil it.
Yeah.
I know. For people that didn't read it,
Yeah.
really?
And that was the biggest reason that I would say
like it. I mean,
You didn't like it either.
well, I mean, like's a tough word.
Yeah.
The story was very interesting, but, yeah, the ending was tough.
Yeah, it is.
It was true.
It's truth. Indeed. Thank you. Anyone else want to share? Nothing.
Do you define whether you're just reporting on something or whether it's race? I can't really separate them out. I mean, it may be the way things were, but it was racism. So it has a level of emotion to it. It has a level of intent to it.
When we talk about racism, are we talking about the indoctrination we have had in history since we were kids? You know, that the slaves were happy and the masters were good. And all of a sudden we're getting real data, real facts, that we were gonna, because it goes against the propaganda.
Really.
We are gonna be, we're gonna become uncomfortable.
It is uncomfortable. And I can tell you that listening to this book for me was uncomfortable. I did not say at the end of it, similar to like I did with a Michelle Obama book. I said, whew, yeah, that was quite a journey she took. And it was like there were some upsides and some things that I could point to and say, I'm inspired by that. And this one was very tough for me to listen to and for me to then acknowledge that, not just that I'm acknowledging it, but it's a reminder of some things that, like you said, you want to try to look for the good and the happiness in the world and life. And absolutely not everything is that way. And even now, you look back then and look like beginning, middle, this is not the end, it's still a journey. So it definitely is just different periods, and the way it looked, it presented was the underpinnings were the same, but the underpinnings were the same, but how it presented was just slightly different. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the fold, Darley, sorry. Oh, like Darlington, but Darlington was where they were. But Darley, and then also talking about Darley's birth. What was special about Darley and one of the main characters? Does anybody want to share?
Well, obviously the connection between both the trainer, the father,
Mm-hmm.
and the son, it lasted for a lifetime.
It did,
And it was the most meaningful relationship in his life.
indeed. Particularly because he, so thank you so much for that. But particularly because he was enslaved. So in that time, what was unique about him, which his name was Jared with one T, he was enslaved. His father was free. Like he bought his freedom. Yeah, he bought his freedom. And then, he was working to try to free his son. Didn't happen, because what happened? Why didn't he make good on that promise? Do you remember? The father got married and he freed his wife first, then was working on his son. Then what else happened? Right after that, what happened to disrupt that? The horse was sold, and with it,
He was.
yeah. What's the significance of the fact that the horse was sold and with it, Jarrett went with it? I mean, it's a kind of an obvious question, but what are you thinking?
Jared, I didn't read the book,
Mhm.
but just from your description, I'm saying that Jared was like an add-on thing,
Yes, yes,
not that he was a person,
that's correct.
he was a thing. that
He
went
was a
with
thing.
horse.
Yeah. Have you heard the word chattel?
Yeah.
Yeah. Enslaved people were chattel, which means what?
No,
Property.
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 No better than an animal.
Right,
And in fact, in some cases, worse off than an animal. Like in many cases, that thoroughbred horse had better treatment than he did as his caregiver. Did you see that? Yeah, thank you so much. Even though you didn't read it, you got it spot on.
Now,
Yeah,
up to 1900 or
Mhm.
1920.
Yeah.
You could say that same was true of women.
indeed.
They were checked.
Yes, and legally chattel. And yet, even as they were legally chattel, they still had a better living condition sometimes, not always. But I would say no, they always had a better living condition than an enslaved person. Do you know what I mean? But what was significant about what you just said? What happened in this era of the 1850s into the 1900s when they were going through this story? Did they mention anything about women's suffrage in this book? Yes. Do you remember? Who said yes? Yes, please.
What was it? Plays?
Mary Barclay.
Yes.
Yes, the daughter.
The wife was very prominent in the women's suffrage movement.
Yes.
And then the daughters, that one, and the daughters seemed to be, very concerned about Jared at different times.
Yes.
In regards to what was going on, or
Yes.
different people
Yes.
joining with the youth versus.
Correct. Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
It was amazing. In fact, there were a couple of points where they both said that they saved each other. What was the significant way that Mary Barclay saved Jarrett? Do you remember what happened? Anyone? Yeah.
Trying to think of my particular. She let him know that the bad guys were coming.
Indeed, because at that time, if you recall, the horse was going to be sold. And Jarrett was like, first of all, the worst thing ever happened where the owner of the horse gave that foal to Jarrett's father and then reneged on that agreement because there was a clause in the country clubs that said that no, not country clubs, but the racing circuit that said no slave or no enslaved person could own a horse. So therefore he had to, his ego got in the way, all these other things, sold the horse, with it went Jared. So he never got the chance to be freed, his father never had the chance to free him, right? So there's a whole lot of feelings mixed up in that, right? So let's, anybody else have any comments about that stage in the book?
Well, it's one of those where it felt so close to real life rather than fantasized life.
Yeah,
Because what is the right choice in that circumstance?
it's hard.
There didn't look for a win-win.
Mm-mm.
It wasn't.
It was,
There was no, that all there was a win-lose.
it was. Indeed. And in fact, he came back and reconciled with his father when he was on his deathbed because his father felt shame and anguish for not being able to do for him what he had done for himself and his wife, right? So, I mean, that was like gut-wrenching.
And equally true, the decision of Jared to stay with the horse,
Indeed. No choice, right? Yeah,
there was a choice,
there was, but there
But
wasn't. Not for him.
given the connection
Exactly.
and the meaning that the two of them gave each other.
Yeah.
Was that choice.
There was for him, yes. And do you want to say?
Yeah, it struck me that we saw in Jarrett and his interactions with the horse, compassion and understanding and all of the things that were lacking in the relationships between the owners and the slaves.
Indeed. And in fact, do you remember that time that the horse was sent to train with another trainer?
Okay.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And then Jarrett finally got the taste of him being not that he wasn't enslaved, but because he had a higher status as the trainer of this great horse, he had some privileges, so you might call it, that other enslaved people did not have. In fact, during that time where he was ripped out of caring for Darley Lexington, he was put into the slave quarters and he was shown how it was to work in the fields, how it was to be beaten, how it was to pick cotton, all those things that he had been not part of in terms of the enslaved process, the enslaved experience. he was then front and center in that, but then had a chance to do what? Go back, right? Do you remember? Because what was interesting about him going from being enslaved in the fields back to caring for Darlington, Lexington. Do you remember the conditions under which that happened? Does anyone?
The detail escapes me,
Mhm.
in memory, but I remember that period where he was learning to read and write.
Yeah.
And beginning to be able to use that as a tool to
Mhm.
to change circumstances for both the horse and for him.
Indeed, yeah. So that during that time it was harsh, but there were some things he learned then that carried him through to when he finally came to a stature, which was, amazing that he could go back and buy that painting, the painting that he had long lost, and during his enslaved times, it passed through his generations, and he finally got that painting back for his family. If you recall that. And Darlington, Lexington got sick when they were beating him and, forcing him to do things in a way that Jared had never communicated with the horse or cared for the horse. So they brought him back knowing that he was the one that could nurse him back to health and get him to a point where he could race again. So that was interesting for sure. Let's turn our attention from there to the 1950s. What was significant about the transition of the painting from that time in the 1850s to then in the 50s, 1950s? Do you remember how that happened? That the painting came back into play? Anyone? Even online, if you want to comment, that's fine.
It's the architect.
Yeah, it was the art collector. Yeah, it did. It did. So the fact that she was not indentured service, but she was a servant. So this curator who had come from well-to-do means, she had this maid named Annie. Do you remember Annie? So Annie had this photo, this portrait that had been in her family for generations to generations. What was the significance and how did it pass from Annie to the art curator?
She needed money.
Yeah.
To send a kid to college.
She needed to send her brother, right, to college, and that was a big deal. She didn't have the means, but she could sell this painting, and she was able to get her brother through college. And so then it passed to her, the curator. And then what happened to it? Do you know? I kind of want to trace the picture. Does anyone remember what happened after that? Yes, please.
That Paul Mellon had purchased it.
Yes.
And at the end, I'm not quite sure in reading through the acknowledgements at the end. They really didn't know where he had gotten it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody online? I want to just make sure I don't ignore you. Are you checking? They're good. Okay. He's like, I can't believe. Yeah. Anything else about this period in the 1950s that was significant? And these are what was interesting to me about this book. It was a combination of fictitious people and real people, like the artist that died in the car accident. So remember, she bought the car, she sold the car to this artist who was known for alcoholism. And he bought the sports car, she knew it would not be a good idea because he was going to crash drunk. And that's what happened to him, right? So there was a connection between the painting. She got money for her sports car, which then she gave to Annie to get the painting. Do you remember that? Yeah, that was pretty interesting, right? And he, subsequently died. He was a real person. So he was an artist, very avant-garde kind of artist. And she curated his works. And then she came up until this time. I'm trying to make sure I'm not going over time. I could talk for a while. All right, cool. You gotta give me 5 minutes. Yeah. Okay, give me 5 minutes because I'll talk forever. Yeah. So this painting goes from her to then it kind of gets into the hands of this man who lives across the street from whom? Do you remember? Do you remember who lived? It was the researcher, right?
Yeah. Bookstore.
I know, right? And I'm just like, look, Theo, do you remember Theo?
After they had over the bikes.
There were a couple of those in the whole history of this book. There were a couple of things. So what is the significance? How in the world did Theo get this piece of art? Do you remember?
Found it in the trash.
Found it in the trash. Did he find it in the trash?
He took it from the trash.
Well, yeah, sort of. Yeah, what happened? Does anybody remember? And if not, I'll read it.
Her husband's stuff, and she put the painting on her.
She sure did.
It
Hmm.
had nothing to do with him before that, because he had taken her edition, she refused it.
Yeah,
But then, so he picked up the painting, and then she kept struggling when she was moving stuff,
yeah.
so he kept helping her.
Hmm.
The little relationship built, but it showed her attitude toward him.
Yeah. Because of what did he think?
Right.
Because of his race, right?
Because of the threats.
Yeah, yeah.
So I haven't gotten very far.
You're right at the point where he got the painting, right?
Yeah, and then he put it in the closet and forgot about it.
He
just
did.
thought about it again, that's where I stopped.
Okay. That's a good place to stop. And you all don't want me to be doing any spoiler alerts? No spoilers? Does anybody care if I spoil alert? Spoiler alert, I'm just telling you, I'm gonna spoil some things maybe. But if you get to read it, do still read it. I'll tell you, cover your ears if you don't want to hear what I have to say. But what was interesting about that is that here this man was. What was unique about Theo? Does anybody remember that?
His parents were professional academics from Africa.
That's right.
So his background doesn't fit the stereotype, and his experience doesn't fit the normal experience for an American Black.
That's correct. And that's significant. That is very significant. So
He has a naivete that
he does. It does get him into trouble. Yeah, until the very end, honestly. And so the reason why that's important is because I think people always assume that when somebody is brown-skinned here in this country and other places, that they assume that that the experience and the relationships are the same, and they are not. So this man had a mother that was Nigerian and a father, I think, was African-American. They had him, they both were diplomats. So he went through the English system of boarding schools, the best of the best. And he was known for what? Yeah, he was a big polo player. What happened with this polo player? Because they said when he came, he said and declared to Jess, because they recognized his name. He said someone recognized his name. It was a woman from England that came to help with putting the horse back together. Why didn't he play anymore and didn't want to talk about it? Racism, indeed. So people would shout things at him, throw things at him. He had the worst experiences on that circuit when he would play polo. He was a phenomenal player, but couldn't quite get past the racism. So he just completely quit the sport. And so when he came to the US, that naivety that you were referring to, he had a whole experience that was not like a person that grew up in the United States, that had experienced civil rights, Jim Crow, all those things that exist today. He understood racism, but from a different perspective than, say, an African-American person did. So that left him with a disconnect with people in this country. And I totally recognize that, because in some ways I felt that way as well. Not because I didn't have that experience, but because I grew up in the military system. I had a different perspective than some people that say. My biggest challenge was being in Baltimore, going from Lompoc, California to Baltimore City schools. And people said, you dress funny, you look funny, you're funny. Black people that I would go to school. I went to a predominantly Black school in Baltimore, and it was hard for me to find my footing, because my perspective and my speech, my everything was different than what was known to them for their whole lives. Make sense? And so he had similar kind of experience there, and it made it hard for him to find his footing. What else happened for him when he got here in the States, when he started working? What did he do? What was he doing? Anyone? Can't remember? Was he in grad school? Yes, he was in grad school. Yeah, he was in grad school. Yeah, he was in grad school. And he was in grad school to study art. He was getting his PhD. He was on his dissertation. He was trying to, get through his schooling. And at every turn, he found that he was always judged for the color of his skin which he was very disappointed in the US because they were supposed to be so much further along, whatever. He was very concerned about that. What were you gonna say? Oh, nothing. Okay. So
And they didn't like his dissertation topic because it wasn't black enough.
exactly. Exactly. So he was judged, right? So he was in the middle and not here, not there, but kind of in the middle and not really having a foot in either camp, fully footing in either camp.
Cares about horses.
Who cares about horses? And I kind of said the same thing. I'll be honest. I'll be honest, because I didn't have that background and I didn't have that love of horses when I was growing up. I didn't have an exposure to horses when I was growing up. And so when I was reading that, I come to have an appreciation for this whole sport of horse racing, but not really, because I still think, I don't know, I just think about how they treat the animals. And I just don't know if it's something I could ascribe to, but I know that it still exists and it's a very big sport. I know people have appreciation for equestrian art. They have, appreciation for that. It's not something that I subscribe to, but I know that people have appreciation for it.
And I
So-
think equestrian art is worse than caring about horses.
Kind of.
It's more elitist
It
and
is.
more white.
It
and
is.
More just. Why?
Yes.
So-
Why? Exactly. And so what else do you all think about for this book? I mean, for those of you who read it, anything that stands out for me or questions that you have?
You said he was an academic.
Yes.
I wonder what obstacles a Black academic is gonna have at that time. Just I read recently where in 1930,
Mm-hmm.
1930.
Mhm.
The Alexander, Virginia Library, everybody was allowed, except you had to have a library card.
Mm-hmm.
But no blacks were given the library card. It was only whites that were given the library card.
Correct.
And they had a citizen, and that was somewhat, then became separate, but equal there, but.
Mhm.
These little things
Little
And-
but big things, right?
that. We never think of,
Mm-hmm.
that just kind of. Tick here and there, did any of that come out?
Absolutely throughout the whole book, quite frankly. And for him, by looking at him, you would never tell all the accomplishments that he's had or could have. And his life was snuffed out way too soon in this book. I'm going to tell you, spoiler alert, cover your ears. What happens to him at the end?
Police violence.
Yeah, how did that happen?
He was trying to help a white woman who felt that's ravine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if he had been, I don't know if it would have been different if if he were African-American and grew up in this country, that he would have looked at that and said, I'm not going there. But instead, call for help, call 911 and stay on the curb,
Yeah.
right? But he went right in and the police assumed he was the assailant. And without even knowing, he had his cell phone in his hand, held his hands up, and they shot him thinking he had a gun. And look at the news,
Yeah.
and so there's a lot that you can say about this book that really comes to light. And what's interesting is that particular scene is not at all like, oh my gosh, it's an aberration. It's not uncommon. It's more common than you think. And then, people start talking, well, now it's not just the white officers, it's the Black officers, but there's a whole culture in policing that this country has yet to address that is absolutely rooted in racism and against Blacks, particularly Black men in the context of policing and safety and all that other things. It was created to keep people in their place, to keep order, to keep control of the situation and Black people and Black bodies. So, there's a lot that I could say about that. And in the context of this book, it just ends with that. It ends with that. And the woman that he is involved with, we didn't talk about Jess at all. Do you remember Jess? What was important about Jess?
She was from Australia. So she was an outsider as well
She was.
and didn't get the culture in the same way that he didn't.
No. And in fact, what was interesting is that they had dinner, they had a disagreement about how racism shows up. Because she was like, you know, you're too, you're too sensitive kind of thing. And even the woman that came to dinner with them, you're too sensitive. And then this happened to him where he was killed by the police. And so as a result, she had it right here in her face. Like it was, how did she react when that happened? When they told her, they knocked on the door, he was late for dinner. She wondered what happened to him. She had his dog and they knocked on the door.
No, not him. He's different.
Yeah. Not him, he's different. Yes.
Question.
Sure.
There was a New Yorker podcast just recently out where the man was interviewed. They were talking about the woke culture that's sweeping,
Yes.
and David Remnick.
Yeah.
David Remnick was interviewing this man who is edited a dictionary of slang, saying now that woke is being used the way words have been used in the past and disparage large groups of people.
Yeah.
I can see in my mind where that's going to come to a head here.
Mm.
Black History Month, anybody can follow Black History Month, well, you're part of the woke culture. Person reads a book like this, thinks it's a good book, you're part of the woke culture.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that if someone says, this is just that we should just vote for folks who are woke now?
Yeah, it was,
Give us 2 hours.
I know, right?
Would be your gut response. You're among friends here.
I'm among friends, but I also have to be very aware that I'm the only Black person in this room
Yes. Right.
and online, I bet too.
Mhm.
And so the hardship is responding to that. I don't know, I'm just so, it's too much. It's
Okay.
too much.
Okay.
And I would say, the thing I say is that I'm reading this book that I think would be, if you all want me to come back and do it, I really would like for people that are very interested in exactly what you said to read the book called The Conversation by Robert Livingston. I'm reading it now. And it really breaks down that perspective that racism is not something that we need to acknowledge or talk about being woke or doing differently than we're doing. Woke means that you're aware and you're going to do differently. Some people choose to believe that there's no issue and we are not going to do differently. But I really, don't get me started. Don't get me started. I would say, if you start talking about this and you say, I think as a country and as a humanity, we think in very Black and white terms. There's the have-nots. This always been that way, and it probably always will be. The star bellies and the plain bellies niches, to put it in Dr. Seuss terms. And I think that what we fail to realize is that at the center of this is that people believe that there's not enough for everyone, that there's scarcity. And if I happen to acknowledge something that puts everyone on equal footing, then I lose. I lose, you win. Like a win-lose. And instead of looking at it that everybody, if you look at equity and equality, I told you not to get me started.
You're doing
Everybody wins, like everybody raises. And it's not just about race, but it's also, I put also in the same, not exactly the same, but poverty. My gosh, people not having in this country of abundance that people don't have enough to eat, that don't have a roof over their heads, that don't have the healthcare that they need. I mean, this is the book I'm reading now is probably going to be my number 2. Number 1 is Martin Luther King's Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos. If you haven't read that book, please read it. Even in the late 1950s, it was the last book he wrote. It absolutely lays out the way that we could get out of this. And nobody wants to give even a little to make everybody whole. What does that say about our humanity? So to your comment, I think it is in people's interests that want to be the haves to put down anybody that's looking to try to make everyone have. I think it just isn't an interest. And you create vernaculars and you create narratives that keep the churn happening so that you fail to address the real root issues of what is going on in this country and in what is going on for people that not everybody has enough. I don't have tolerance for that kind of language, to be honest. And yet in the conversation, he absolutely talks about people like me that are like, where you kind of have to go, okay, talk to me about why you think that. Tell me more about what you're thinking. I have to get better at that doing. Right now, I'm not so good at it. You know, I don't have a lot of patience for that. But I know that in order for us to all win, we all have to have more of that patience for us to have conversations. Without that, we will not get anywhere. It won't happen without all of us working together and having conversations about the tough stuff. That's awful. That's historical. That's present. You know, this book talks about the past, the near past, and the present. And there's an underlying tone of racism that exists that we have yet to address to a point where we don't talk about it anymore. And we have work to do, lots of work. Yes, please.
Yeah, Mike, saying that the author is Australian.
Yes.
Do you think? Because the author was from a different country, and again, Australia has its own history with its Aboriginal people.
Yes, they do.
You know, are Black
They are Black skinned people. Yes.
and Aboriginal.
Yes,
That went through the same sort of history.
they do.
that In Canada and America, places where
Mhm.
Indigenous people were
Yes.
treated. But do you think that having that distance from our culture, she's seeing more clearly and she writes about it?
You know, that's an interesting, I tried to go through and I listened to a couple or read transcripts from a couple of podcasts. She's given quite a few podcasts. If you go out there, you'll find all kinds of shows she's been on talking about this book and about systemic racism. I think that she can see it a little bit differently, that she's removed because she's living in this country now. What was interesting to me is that I always am leery of white people telling Black stories. Do you know what I mean? When I saw that, I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, here we go again. Yeah, but it was really well done. And what I will appreciate about her is she talks about just how much that's what she does for all of her books. She delves into the minute details of history and she's almost, anyway, I'll ask you, which character, I mean, I'm just kind of going on the face. So what I'm thinking is, like, they asked in one of the book, I'd asked for book study questions, and she was like, the question was, which character do you think that Geraldine Brooks most resonates with, or what she's most connected with? And I had to think about that, and she's most connected with Jess, because she puts everything meticulously, Jess puts meticulously everything together to create this animal that existed years ago, because she believes that by doing that, you're telling the story of that animal. And so she did the same thing for this book. She is not a person of color, and she did her homework to make sure that the narrative was not her narrative, it was from an authentic point of view. And she went back through transcripts and things of that nature to get that story of Theo, and she got the story also of Jarrett. You know, those were stories she couldn't tell, but I think she really resonated with Jess's story. So yeah, I think that that's true. I don't know if I've ever heard her say it that way, but I think that's a really good observation. So thank you.
I can't wait to read the book and see
It's
it.
awesome.
So,
Yeah. I mean, I like museums and I like natural history, but this was a whole different viewpoint of it that I really appreciated after reading the book. Mhm. Oh, I kept you late. Anyway, so any other parting comments? I would highly recommend that you read this book. I would say I may not have liked it, but I like the story that it told, and it told it from a perspective that you can gain some insights about the historical racism, especially in the racehorse industry, where it was built off of Black and brown people. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all.